Christie, chapter 14. Oh, I gotta tell you, I've had a day. I've been um, getting this room ready for the Christmas tree that's going to go up next week. We're not going to decorate it until the 29th. So I had to get rid of a lot of, not get rid of, but I had to move a lot of stuff back into the old office to make room so that I could work in here for the holidays. So that meant moving stuff. That room is an absolute wreck. It's just a bunch of stuff in there, Christmas presents that have to be wrapped, all that stuff. But I've got this organized and my floor's been swept. And while we were picking up the floor, because I took a garbage bag and I emptied my garbages in here. I swept the floor. I emptied the garbage in the bathroom, la, 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 la. Right? So it's kind of my day off. It's a day of rest, but my day of rest is do a load of dishes, sit down and play a game of Yahtzee because my knees have had it for that amount. Have a game of Yahtzee, get back up, put those dishes away, do another load of dishes, sweep a floor, empty a garbage, sit down, back up, sit down. Howie's getting an idea of how I function on a daily basis. But I had a screwdriver on the floor and I wasn't thinking and I tossed it to my desk and it hit my monitor. And even though my monitor's not glass, it showed like it lines going all through it and it looked like it was cracked glass. Thank God we had this old Acer one downstairs. Let's hope it lasts. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Christie chapter 14. All right, now, I don't want to overheat my phone, but I'm going to move you guys a little bit so I can see better. All right, everything's been moved around. All right. Wrong glasses, Beth. All right, chapter 14. On Saturday morning, Fairlight arrived at the mission before we had finished breakfast. She was wearing a freshly laundered blue check gingham dress with a wide white collar and this time, shoes. Since David was going to be stringing telephone wire rather than working on the bell tower, I took Fairlight over to the empty schoolhouse where we started our lesson on 2 desks, pulled side by side, before an open window. I had a box of materials ready, and Fairlight was all eagerness to see what was in the box. From magazines, I had cut out some pictures of landscapes to use for background scenery, some figures of men, women, and children pasted onto cardboard bases so they could be stood upright, as I used to do with my paper dolls when I was a very little girl. A copy of the alphabet printed in large clear letters for my first grade class, a Bible, a fresh ruled pad, and some pencils. Since teaching an adult to read was a new experience for me, I was still not sure how to begin. It would not do, I felt, to downgrade the dignity of a human being like Fairlight Spencer by using the primer books for 6 and 7-year-olds. The rat ran from the cat. Here the boy sat. Then, too, I believed that Fairlight would learn more readily than the children, and I wanted to give her, even in this first lesson, the concept of words as ideas. And since I knew from having seen some of her quilt patterns and flower arrangements that she was a creative person, surely she would learn fastest if I could find an imaginative way to teach her. My problem was how to achieve this. I picked up the Bible. There are lots and lots of words in this book. How soon will I be able to read it, Miss Christie? In no time, and I'll tell you why. Every single word in this book and all the words together use only 26 English letters. These here. So after you've learned just 26 and know how to put the letters together from different words, then you can read. Easy. Her eyes shone. I'd like that best in the world. Already she was concentrating on that alphabet. After we had read it aloud twice, she became so intent on learning it that she almost forgot I was there. So I sat back watching her, feeling instinctively that I should let her set her pace, even do most of the talking, if she would. At last she sighed and looked at me. I think I've got it. A, B, C, D. And on she went, making only one mistake. Next, we propped up a backdrop picture of a landscape drenched in sunlight. Now, Fairlight, you pick out one of the paper people from this pile. So she selected a dapper-looking man and stood him up before the landscape. We learned man, and my eager pupil practiced saying it and forming the letters. So soon we went on to tree, light, sun, grass, sky. It was at that point Fairlight stumbled onto her own kind of phonetics, the relation between the way the word looked and how it sounded. She was thrilled as if she had found a jewel in the dust. She rolled the word sky over and over on her tongue and spelled it again and again. This went on until we had our first 10 words. Then I opened the Bible to the first chapter of Genesis. Now, Fairlight, look at this. The words on this page are just ideas marching, like this one. And God said, "Let there be light." Light. There it is. I see it. Her slender finger was on the word. Oh, I love the light. Don't you? I hate the darkness. Let there be light. I sat there thinking that I had never seen light dawn so quickly for anyone as for this woman. What an alive mind she had. She scarcely needed instruction, only a chance to let the light come. Teaching Fairlight Spencer was going to be pure delight. Up to this point in her life, she had been like some outcast child staring through the iron railings of the tall fence around the great estate of knowledge, longing to romp with the other children on the clipped lawn side, but always excluded. Excuse me. She was learning to read and write the English language as the key to unlock those gates. For the first time that Saturday morning, the hinges moved. The gates began to swing open. The Elysian fields of knowledge and of identification with other human beings would soon be hers, where she could roam and explore and even cavort. On another Saturday morning, I was invited to Miss Alice Henderson's for the sewing circle, which met only on the 2 weekends a month that she was in Cutter Gap. But the women enjoyed the meeting so much, Miss Alice told me, that she wanted to gather them every week. Would I take charge of the circle in her absence? This first time she wanted me to watch and listen in preparation for that. As I headed down the hill, I noticed how the gently sloping roof of Miss Alice's home seemed to tie the building to the ground. Sunshine and snow and rain and heavy mountain mists had already weathered the unpainted shingles and the logs. Native shrubs hugged the walls closely, so that the cabin, though only 5 years old, looked as if it always stood upon this patch of earth, solid, immovable, at one with the hills and the sky. How unmistakably her cabin bore the flavor of Miss Alice's personality. In both the woman and her home, there was an effortless beauty, never straining for effect, a harmony that seemed to come from having one's roots down in a place where the roots were meant to be. There was something else I had noticed too, an initial acceptance of herself as she was, and so of the other people with her foibles. And so she did as little scolding or criticizing of others for their foolish behavior or their sins as anyone I had ever known. It was not that she was willing to compromise with wrongdoing or poverty or ignorance, just that she was a long step ahead of wasting emotional energy on fretting. I love Miss Alice. And she never put pressure on the rest of us to accept her opinions. The secret of her calm seemed to be that she was not trying to prove anything. She was. That was all. And her stance toward life seemed to say, God is, and that is enough. But why was it enough? That's what I had to find out. Even supposing one had proof of the existence of God, well, that's what faith was designed for, right, folks? How could the fact of God suffice when all around us were conditions crying to be righted? How could Miss Alice be so sure that he had the world in his hand? After only 3 months in the cove, here I was already fretting and stewing and pawing the ground in my reforming zeal, at least inside myself. Not Alice Henderson. There had been times recently when I had found her Quaker calmness maddening. Always my thinking came to this point and stopped. Beyond that, understanding ceased. Miss Alice knew something I did not know. That was why I watched her for every chance to be with her, to observe her in action. One reason I had agreed so readily to these Saturday mornings with the women. I quickened my pace toward the cabin. I should be there ahead of the others to help greet them, but as I stepped from under the fir trees, I saw that an old woman had reached the yard ahead of me. The old lady made quite a picture with her black skirt over a Balmoral petticoat as she stepped up to the door, holding herself with unconscious dignity. Miss Alice heard us and opened the door. Aunt Polly, Teague, and Christie, have you two met? No, I thought not. Do come in. Is there something, dear? Do you want me to call? I can't call it. Okay. At closer range, the one named Aunt Polly looked as if she stepped out of a Rembrandt portrait. Above the black skirt, a faded calico shirtwaist was buttoned high on her neck. Cornflower blue eyes were sunk deep in a parchment skin crisscrossed with a network of fine wrinkles. Because the face was shrunken, the ears looked too large for the head. Aunt Polly, how have you been? Miss Alice asked nicely. Tolerable, can't complain. Old bones be cold bones, I guess. Gosh, she sounds like me. Miss Alice turned to me. Aunt Polly has a rare distinction. She's the oldest woman in the cove. 92, isn't that right, Aunt Polly? 92, 93, I can't be bothered. The cornflower blue eyes snapped and crackled. When my 18th young'un was birthed on my 50th name day, just took a notion to drop all such out in my head. Birthdays are just a botheration. I looked at her in astonishment. 18 children, a baby when she was 50. And she was apparently far from done with the business of life. I like Aunt Polly. But now the rest of the group was arriving. Finally, there were 12, including Fairlight, who had already had her reading lesson with me that morning, and Ruby May, who refused to be left out of anything and who had been looking forward to the sewing circle as a great social event. She had persuaded Lizette Holcomb to come with her and Clara Spencer. I was glad to see other mothers of my school children, too. Opal McCone, still pale and wan from childbirth, and Mary Allen and Lenore Teague. Then there were two others whom I had not met before. Granny Barclay, who was said to be the last granny woman of the cove, official midwife, but whose continual squinting towards something now seriously wrong with her eyes. Then there was a young girl, Liz Ann Robertson. Liz Ann looked 14, certainly not more than 15, but was already married and obviously in the family way. It was a group of such extremes of age that I was curious to see what Miss Alice would do. She began by serving sassafras tea and big chunky sugar cookies using delicate Limoges china. All over again, I noticed Fairlight's hands as she handled the beautiful china cup, putting it carefully to her lips, and I had the curious feeling that they were the hands of a great lady, that the red, work-worn skin was only a disguise which would drop away when some evil enchantment broke. When the tea was gone, she lifted the cup of its saucer and nestled it between both hands. It feels good, she said, wondering, like silk to the skin. She must have been speaking for all of the women because they acted as if they were sipping liquid ambrosia straight from Mount Olympus, not out of those cups. Politely, they tried to restrain themselves on the cookies, but soon there was not a cookie left. I see that most of you have brought quilts to peace, their hostess observed. While you sew, Christie and I could take turns reading to you from the Bible. Now that would purely be a delight, Aunt Polly agreed. Then after the reading, Granny Barclay broke in, would you pray a little for the folks that has miseries and poorly young'uns and such like? Of course we will. My eyes are worse than ordinary. Don't see good no more, but Doc's a studying on it. Clara Spencer asked cautiously, Granny, you be seeing a lot of the Doc. Is it true what pretty nigh everybody says, that there's a room at his place that he keeps locked up and won't let anybody see? Miss Alice picked up some of the teacups and the empty cookie plate to take to the kitchen. Aye, lassie, for a fact, Granny smacked her lips as if over some secret knowledge. That scattered talk, Liz Ann's voice lowered confidentially. That yon room's where Mistress McNeil died, so Doc won't take no nonsense about a single thing being tampered with. This was the kind of talk that Ruby May liked best. Her eyes glittered. I heard more'n that. Doc knowed how to preserve his wife's mortal remains, and he wouldn't have no funeralizing at all. Still keeps her in that room. On her way into the room, Miss Alice had heard the last sentence. I could see that she was eager to turn off such wild talk. Lizette, didn't I hear that your mother had a new baby? Long time back that was, 4 months now. Ailin sure cries a heap. Was the young'un a gal baby? Aunt Polly asked. Yes, it was a gal. The girl paused a moment, her face immobile. And it's a gal yet. I choked back a laugh. I still could not tell when these people were joking. Did Lizette mean to be funny? Clara, sitting on a stool in the corner, said, I know somebody's who's sick. Bessie Coburn hurt her leg the other evening when the sled turned over on her. Doc McNeil says the leg's not broke, though. It made me feel like an insider to know that they were not referring to a snow sled, but to the drag sleds pulled by a mule or a horse, used because of the almost perpendicular slopes. You best pray for Liz Ann, too, Ruby May added. She wouldn't tell you herself, but her time's well nigh here. While the women worked on their quilt pieces and Miss Alice cleared away the rest of the dishes, I started to read at the place where she pointed out. I was still self-conscious about reading aloud to grown-ups from the Bible because I was afraid of the pronunciation of all those strange Oriental names. The passages selected were marked by numbered slips of paper stuck between the pages. It was just as well, since I would not have known whether Jude was in the Old Testament or New, or whether Kings came before or after Isaiah. But I had not covered more than a few verses before I realized that the women were listening, not to me, but to the stories Miss Alice had chosen. Somehow their absorption made me forget myself so that I was too caught up in the words. A certain man had 2 sons. It was the familiar parable of the prodigal son. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion. The man ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Let us eat and be merry, for this was my son who was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. In this tranquil room, the ancient words had life then. Suddenly I realized that the language of Scripture did not sound strange to these women, because the King James translators had been closer to the Cove speech than was present-day English. Every day I heard "I" and "verily" and "at cock-crow" and "thrice" and "brutish" and "noisome" and "hireling." When I paused at the end of the parable, there was only the faint hissing of the apple logs on the fire and the echo of Miss Alice's soft footsteps in the kitchen. The concentration of the group was so intense that it was almost palpable. Then Miss Alice came back into the room and settled herself in the red-winged chair and took the Bible. It was soon apparent that she had selected the passages with one thought in mind. She wanted these women to hear for themselves the assurance and reassurance in the scripture of the love of God for them. She made few comments, just that let the passages speak their own message. Whether from the Old Testament or the New, one by one, the verses were laying a perfectly fitting mosaic, a picture of God as a father who loves us more than any earthly father could, who knows our needs before we ask for them, but who still wants us to come and ask confidently as any rightful son or daughter should. It was the unforgettable picture which Jesus had etched in such earthly words of his Father going after a single lost and bruised lamb, of God the Father running down the road to receive any child who has been in a far country who at last wants to come home. I sat there entranced as I watched Miss Alice. I had noticed that in her presence, I often would have big thoughts, ideas that went so far beyond my usual ones that they astonished me. It was not too much that what Miss Alice had sparked the thoughts, rather what she was. Okay, it was not so much that what Miss Alice said that sparked the thoughts, rather what she was. Even now, on the perimeter of my mind, new ideas hovered and darted, some of them just eluding me. Miss Alice seemed to think that once the poverty-stricken Highlanders gripped the fact of God's love for them, even for them, then in time they would have everything else they needed. But how was that? Would there really be believing in a loving and adequate God and fear, for example, or poverty? What would it do to educational needs? Or how would it affect their belief in superstitious magic? But now Miss Alice closed the Bible and was bringing this part of the morning to a close with the prayer that the group had requested. Her words were informal and direct, clothed in no liturgy at all. In the simplest kind of way, they were directed at God's adequacy to meet human problems. After all, the needs of these women were real, as solid as the earth on which they walked and the garden dirt in which they dug, as substantial as the mountains that towered over them, as near as pain and disease and childbirth. In their simplicity, they knew about the need for daily bread. So once again, a towering thought came to me. True prayer, then, can be rooted only in recognition of genuine need. Amen, said Granny Barclay, and pronounced resoundingly. I fancy that, Miss Henderson. Your talk would put heart into a hollow log. You make the Almighty seem compatible. Aye, it makes my soul happy, Aunt Polly agreed. Not like the most preacher persons always hollering about hellfires. Been hearing them talk that away ever since I was a slip of a girl. They'd start out slow, but as soon as they'd get limbered up and going good, they'd take to pounding and pounding their fists on pulpits. Sweat rolling off in their faces, wiping and wiping. Till Lord help my time of day, seemed like they'd crept a little too close to them fires themselves. The blue eyes blazed in the wrinkled face as the voice went on. All my born days, them preacher men made me think I was backsliding down the slippery path to hell. But when I hit my 70th name day and couldn't feel no singeing from them fires, I calculated that from there on in, I'd just disremember about them devils, pertin up and let the fires roar on without me. Granny Barclay shook her finger at the old woman. Polly Ann Dillingham Teague, you have a sassy tongue in your head. Fiddlesticks, better than being a say-nothing person. Saying a say-nothing in person. Tactfully, Miss Alice changed the subject. Granny, I want to show Miss Christie your quilt. It's a nice pattern. What do you call it? Hearts and gizzards. Here it is. I moved for a closer look. Is that an old pattern? Aye, Mostly the patterns was handed down. It's beautiful. But weaving is a heap purtier than quilting. Fairlight Spencer spoke with feeling. Sometimes I hanker after it, a sitting on the weaving bench, watching the blossoms come out and smile at you from the coverlid. She means coverlet. Her words seemed to make all the older women nostalgic. Weaving was apparently almost a lost art in the cove. You know, store-bought and clothes don't wear at all, Aunt Polly offered almost quietly, now that she was off theology and on to more domestic matters. There's something about a settin' and tromping the treadles. Nothing can fret a body then. Granny, ain't I seen a foot power loom in your yard? Ain't nobody used it in years. Nobody excepting the chickens, that is. They like it for roosting. I memorize how I used to make up ballads to the hum of the shuttle and the thud of the loom beating up the web. It was purely a pleasure, that it was. Miss Alice had been listening carefully. How hard would it be to start weaving again? Do any of you remember how? Aunt Polly answered promptly. Surely, Granny Barclay and I know. We made our wedding kivers together. And in my loft, Fairlight Spencer said eagerly, I have a heap of drafts that come from Scotland, belong to my mama and her mama before her. What are drafts? Obviously, Christie. Patterns for weaving the designs. Come from the other side of the water. Pieces of paper rolled up and tied with black thread. Look kind of like music. Tell you how to make Queen Anne's Delight, Trail and Vine, Young Man's Fancy, Wig Rose, and Road in the Wilderness. You know, some of my friends in Pennsylvania and Miss Christie's in Asheville would leap at the chance to buy hand-woven things. I'm sure they would. What would you think about doing some weaving to sell? If you mean for cash money, Mrs. McHone answered, that would surely be welcome. The group was immediately enthusiastic. Think ye, Granny Barclay asked, squinting and wiping her eyes, that we could use the new wagon that Miss Christie helped to get us to tote my loom? Certainly I could. What about the dyeing? Clara asked. Ain't hard, Granny sounded a little smug. Walnut and butternut hulls for browns and blacks. Pokeberries make lavender. Hickory bark makes the lastingest yeller I ever seed. Matters for red and pink, and blue's best of all, Aunt Polly interrupted. Howsomever we'd have it to put off till August to set the blue pot. Indigo don't bloom till then. My mama had a blue pot that's in our barn yet. These kind of books, folks, I'm going to interrupt for a second, is where we actually hear history, right? Don't you use any bought-on dyes? Ruby May asked. She and Liz Ann and Clara seemed to know a little about these old-time skills as I did. Aunt Polly rolled up her quilt scraps and rose to her feet. Don't fancy bought-in colors for wearing clothes. Fade right away. Well, gotta take my foot in hand and get along home. As the meeting broke up, the women were still chattering, full of plans for the future. I stayed to help Miss Alice wash the Limoges china and put it carefully back into place in the corner cupboard. While we were washing dishes, I questioned, by the way, what's wrong with Granny Barclay's eyes? I'm afraid it's trachoma. The eyes get irritated and bloodshot from granulations on the lids, on the inside of the lids. A lot of itching and burning and discharge. Eventually the eyeballs harden, you know, and the sight gets progressively worse. It seems as if there's a lot of eye trouble around here. I never saw so many crossed eyes before. You're right. Crossed eyes are probably from too much intermarrying. The trachoma is something else again, a real scourge. There's a surprising amount of it, along with hookworm and typhoid and consumption. Dr. McNeil helped me persuade the Public Health Service to make a survey of the parts of the Appalachians to see for themselves how much trachoma there was. That's how we have the temporary eye hospital in Lyleton. Many a Saturday, Neil takes a wagon load of patients in there. Oh, that reminds me. I've been wanting to ask you something about Dr. McNeil. David hinted at a story about the doctor's ancestors, said something about a castle, and for me to ask you sometime. She smiled at me, amused at my undisguised inquisitiveness. Why not ask Neil? I don't know him that well. She rinsed out her dishcloth, carefully hung it over the side of the sink, dried her hands, and took off her big apron. Well, it's a really long chapter, folks, but it's only a few more pages. I'm actually going to end it here. It's a good story, all right, and you don't really understand the mountain people until you've heard it. You want to know? You want it now? Can you spare another 15 or 20 minutes? Can you guys spare another 15 or 20 minutes? Let me know in the comments. Of course. Well then, let's see. Where shall I begin? She was talking as we made our way back to the fire. I relaxed, curled up on the hearth rug near the hearth. The red chair set off Miss Alice's light hair, and there was a faraway look in her eyes. As the story unfolded, it carried us both out of the quiet, firelit room in Cutter Gap, Tennessee, back across space, through time to the summer of 1745 in Scotland. Okay, so we'll continue. It seems that Neil McNeil, ancestor of the doctor, born in, something like 1720, lived in a castle on the island of Barra in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. The nearest town, I'm told, was a tiny port called Campbelltown. That year of 1745, this Neil had been visiting cousins and friends in New York and Philadelphia that had gone on to Wilmington, North Carolina, and Cape Fear. He was over here to feel out a business venture. He and a friend named Baliol of the island of Jura had gone to now my pronunciations may not be good, okay? The idea of forming some sort of landholding syndicate in the New World. Remember, this is 1745. But while they were away, hard times fell on the Highlands. That summer, Prince Charles Edward, the great-great-grandson of Mary Queen of Scots, had determined to try and win back the throne of England and Scotland for the Stuarts. Oh, yeah. And then there was it was really bad. It was really bad. He hired a French frigate and landed on the Isle of Eriskay. To the Highlanders, he was the Bonnie Prince, 24, tall, handsome, curly, hair almost gold at the ends, large brown eyes. It was said that he could charm anyone out of all conscience. There were numbers of songs about him sung by the mountain people to this day. I heard little Sam Houston singing one of them in his thin piping voice just last week when I returned some candle molds to his mother. Come o'er the stream, Charlie, dear Charlie, brave Charlie, come o'er the stream, Charlie, and dine with MacLean. And though you be weary, we'll make your heart cheery and welcome our Charlie and his royal train. But dear Charlie, brave Charlie's coup had failed. The promised French help never came. Many of the clans never did rise to support the Charles Edward, and the Highlanders were defeated by the English in the bloody massacre of Culloden Moor in April 1746. Excuse me. Well then, when Neil McNeil returned to Scotland in November of 1746, somehow he had still not heard about the disaster at Culloden, nor did he know the situation he was heading into in the Highlands. Communication was slow in those days. Details of that homecoming have been handed down in the doctor's family. How Neil strode over the ancient bridge across the moat of his beloved castle, Kissimmel, pausing to look back at the tossing sea and the wild headlands that he loved. Every detail of his ancestral home was just as he remembered it. There were the desolate peat bogs, where the peewit cried, and the wine-red hills beyond, where Hebridean black houses of his people, thatched roofs weighed down with stones. There was the odor of burning peat and the smell of the inescapable fish industry. And inside the damp stone castle, there was still the deep glow of polished walnut and mahogany and the ancestral portraits on the walls. But there was a change. Ordinary people there would have been a lamb roasting. Ordinarily, there would have been a lamb roasting on the spit on the gigantic fireplace. There was none. Food was very scarce. It was then that Neil learned the hard facts. After Culloden, his father had been taken prisoner along with some 3,500 other Highland men. No one knew what happened to him, though they did know that 700 odd had died from their confinement in filthy, overcrowded prisons, and that another 120 had been hanged in London. They made their tartans outlaw. They couldn't wear their kilts. They outlawed the kilt and the family tartans. The tartan is a plaid, but every family had their own colors and own weave. Excuse me. Thank you. The English government, thinking that clan loyalties were the basis of all trouble, had passed the Disarming Act, among other things, prohibited the wearing of any tartan garment. The Duke of Cumberland's men, under order, were roaming the countryside, burning homesteads and grain, driving away cattle. Their aim was to destroy the economy. Sounds like our government is today in Canada. And they succeeded. So few men were left to provide for their families that many women and children were actually starving. Prince Charles Edward, with the help of many, including Flora MacDonald, still a heroine among these North Carolina and Tennessee folk, had escaped back to France. A reward of 30,000 pounds in English gold had been placed on his head. That much gold would have set up a poverty-stricken Highland community for the rest of its days. And many of the people might, understandably, have felt resentment at the prince who had led them into such sorrow and trouble. Yet not a Highlander could be found who would touch a penny of the reward. But there had been even worse news for Neil. It was the last bitter drag to learn that a great price had been put on his grandfather's head since he was Roderick, the 39th chief of Clan MacNeil. The frail old man had had to flee the castle to live in a cave somewhere in the mountains. A lot of them did that. In fact, all of Argyllshire was full of clansmen hiding out, hunted like wild deer by royalist troops, a price on every head. But the people were intensely loyal. They would not betray kinsfolk. Neil watched his Granny Jean, failing already before the tragedy, now all but out of her mind, haunting the upper windows of the castle, her old eyes searching, hoping. Naturally, the business venture which Neil and Balliol had evolved was out of Neil's head at once, of no consequence compared to the suffering around him. He had friends in London and legal contacts, so he went there to see if he could get any relief or alleviation for the Highlanders. Neil did not succeed. But there in London, his solicitor, William Dick, pointed out to him the one legal loophole left. Because he had been out of country during all of the rebellion, his portion of the family fortune could not be touched by the English government. So after much thought, Neil decided to buy a ship and offer transport to North Carolina as many of his countrymen as wanted to emigrate. Thus, in the spring of 1747, there was jubilation on the docks of Campbelltown as 480 Scottish men and women sailed in Neil's ship, the Curlew, which was a bird, for America and a new life. Now they would be able to wear all the tartan they pleased, to speak their native Gaelic, to make a living without having it wrested from them, to sing as they worked. Yes, rousing Jacobite songs, if they wanted to. The townspeople went wild on the docks that morning. The curlew meant for them freedom, freedom to breathe, freedom to be. And Neil McNeil of Barra watched with tears streaming down his cheeks. He did not himself sail with that first group. There were still business details to be concluded. He intended to shuttle the curlew back and forth so long as his funds lasted. Word had been received from other fugitives that Neil's grandfather had died as a result of the months of exposure and hardship. Now Neil's mother took Granny Jean's place at the upper windows of the castle, her eyes searching the sweeping uplands and the misty glens, listening to the bleating of the few sheep left and the cries of the seabirds, always hoping to see a familiar figure striding across the moor. But the weeks and the months went by, and Neil's father did not come. They never learned what his fate had been. We're almost there, folks. Now, this is his great-great-grandfather. At last, Neil put his estate in the hands of a solicitor and appointed trustees. His family had always been canny businessmen. He provided for Granny Jean and for his mother, who refused to leave so long as there was any hope that her husband was alive, and for their retainers in the upkeep of Castle Kissymule. The rest of the profits from the rents and the mercantile business which he had inherited would be used to bring immigrants to America. With him, at the second sailing of the Curlew, Neil brought some mementos of the hoary old castle. Perhaps you've seen them, Christie, in his namesake's cabin. A cherry chest of drawers, a low chair with a spindled back, an English mantel clock, that pipe of his with the silver band inscribed in Gaelic, some smaller things. Up to that time, Neil had been a bachelor, too preoccupied to think of romance. On the long voyage to North Carolina, he met Flora Riddle and fell in love with her. They were married at Wilmington soon after they landed. In all, the Curlew made 4 round trips. Neil was personally responsible for bringing some 1,800 Scottish folk to the New World. At first, they settled in established farming communities near the coast. But the newcomers from Scotland, with their strange dress and speech, their violent convictions and prejudices, and reckless sincerities, seemed savage to the townspeople, and in no time at all the exiles were homesick for the sight of a mountain. Longed to find a spot which they could call theirs for their ain folk. So in 1750, Neil led them across the narrow, hazardous passes, fording rivers, penetrating into the virgin forest of what was then Washington County, North Carolina, to later become Tennessee. Some of the grannies, like Aunt Polly Teague and Granny Barclay, have told me that when at last their forebears lifted their eyes to the smoky blue of these mountains, the peaks lost in ragged cloud edges, for all the world like Ben Nevis or Coolins, when once again they saw valleys thick with morning mist, so reminiscent of their Scottish bogs, when they listened to the music of the tumbling mountain streams, they wept. They had come home again. Never would they forget their ballads, their Highland stories of the occult, the Gaelic superstitions. Always their men would be fighters, quick to take offense, slow to forgive. To their children and to their children's children, they would hand down their love of race, their personal loyalties, their stubbornness, their distrust of governments. Can you see I have Scottish roots? Their civility to no man. These are their strengths and their weaknesses, their glory, and sometimes, Christie, their damnation. Miss Alice had finished. We sat silent for a long time, watching the flickering firelight, lost in the spell of the story. At last I thanked her and slipped out, eager to be alone with my thoughts. No wonder Dr. McNeil had said, "These are my people. I love them." It was not until later that I began to wonder how Miss Alice had been able to tell it like that. Not as though she were telling someone else's story at all, as though somehow, sometime she had lived so completely in the McNeil family that she had made it her own. We'll see you next time for chapter 15. I'm liking Sundays for this. I am, right? I love you guys. Take care. God bless. And we'll see you next time for chapter 15 of Christie by Catherine Marshall. Love you.